More energy bill relief being promised in the latest pre-election sweetener from the government, and the opposition says it won't stand in the way. It puts more pressure on the federal budget, already returning to deficit. I'm David Speers. Welcome to Insiders. Two days out from a pre-election budget, the Prime Minister has this morning promised another round of energy bill relief. Households will receive $150 off their power bills over the second half of this year, costing the budget $1.8 billion. The Coalition described similar relief last year as a band-aid on a bullet wound, but won't stand in the way this time. Peter Dutton has been quick to back a series of Labor spending promises, including a pledge for cheaper medicines. The opposition leader, meanwhile, has faced difficulty over the Coalition's own agenda, including whether it plans to hold a referendum on citizenship laws.
We've got a fair bit to cover this morning. We're in the home stretch of the government's fourth budget.
The Treasurer Jim Chalmers says the world has entered an era of uncertainty and it's playing havoc with the federal budget.
We're in a whole new world of uncertainty. Global economic uncertainty, new world of uncertainty.
This bloke has a PhD in blame shifting.
Ex-cyclone Alfred has blown a big hole in next week's budget.
Treasury expects there will be about a $1.2 billion hit to economic output.
And he's found excuses wherever he looks. In the past, it's been Vladimir Putin, it's been President Xi, now it's Donald Trump, Cyclone Alfred.
You aren't just becoming the ambassador for excuses, are you?
Oh, of course not, Carl.
We're just doing a press conference.
Australia cannot afford any more climate disasters.
Mr. Dutton, why are you lying to the Australian people?
Act like a magician.
Opposition leader Peter Dutton is considering a deportation referendum as part of his election pledge.
The last referendum didn't seem to go down well. It cost more than $400 million. Can't we work out some other way?
We want to keep kids safe in our community, then I don't think you can put a price on that.
Well, this is another thought bubble from Peter Dutton.
The Prime Minister dismisses it as a thought bubble.
It's really like a soap bubble because it lasts about as long as a bit of a soap bubble.
We're exploring all options. Obviously, a referendum is expensive.
So are you worried that Australians might see this referendum as a distraction?
I'm worried every day about the cost of living crisis.
Peter Dutton attempting to wash away some coalition confusion.
If we can tighten the laws, we do that as a last resort. If there's a change to Constitution required, we can have that discussion. What I want to do is to keep you and your family safe.
He's like a character dials it up from Spinal Tap. Everything goes up to 11.
Our Prime Minister is not mature enough when it comes to these discussions.
They need to start getting serious about policy.
Thank you. Here's all right?
Yeah, it's good.
My guest this morning is Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor. First, let's check what's making news. Plenty of coverage of the energy bill relief this morning. Households and small businesses will receive $150 off their bills in a 6-month extension of the existing scheme at a cost of $1.8 billion to the budget. It comes as power prices are set to rise as much as $200 a year in the eastern states. Tuesday's budget isn't expected to include many other new announcements. I understand there won't be additional defence spending beyond what's already committed. The government will argue it's already spending $50 billion more over the coming decade than the Coalition had committed to. And a couple of stories this morning from my ABC colleagues. Andrew Green reports delivery of second-hand Australian tanks to Ukraine could be delayed after the Trump administration's recent freeze on military assistance to the war-torn nation. An American-run logistics hub in Poland has apparently suspended operations. And Olivia Casely reports the head of the National Anti-Corruption Commission continues to hold senior roles in the Army Reserves as the watchdog probes a $45 billion defence contract. The NAC has confirmed Paul Brereton has recused himself from 6 defence matters, but won't say whether he has stepped away from a referral regarding the Hunter frigate project. Well, we're going to start this morning on the pre-election budget. With measures like this energy bill relief announced this morning, Labor's trying to do 3 things: remind voters of the help it's previously provided, spell out its plans to offer more and warn of the risks posed by the coalition. Peter Dutton has been critical of government spending and opposed previous handouts, but in the shadow of an election and with the polls turning, he's not standing in the way now. Winning votes is now the priority for both sides as the budget slides back into deficit. Let's see what the panel makes of it. We're joined this week by Kenny, Melissa Clarke and Paul Sakkal. Very good morning to all of you. Let's start on the pre-budget announcement this morning, energy bill relief. This was widely anticipated. Mark, in last year's budget when this was announced, $300 for everyone, no means test, regardless of your income. There was criticism that the rich were getting a handout, but also that this was an artificial way to force down inflation. Remember, we had a long debate about that. 12 months on, is this going to be as contentious, or has it been accepted that this actually works?
Well, I think it's there's a critical difference between last year and this year, David, and that is that we're on the eve of an election this year. So that colours everything, of course, and we get the opposition already waving this through, saying it's not going to stand in the way of this relief. So that changes the atmospherics of it pretty fundamentally, I would have thought. You're right, there was a lot of talk about whether this was going to fuel inflation when it was originally thought of, criticism of whether that was the right strategy. The opposition was against it in that case, but things have changed. As I say, the political imperatives now are to try and speak to people who are doing it tough, as politicians like to say, and that's what's driving the response.
And why have they gone for only 6 months extra here? So this will be from July to the end of the year, but not a full 12 months. Does anyone...
Well, look, I think they don't want to commit to making these kind of offers beyond that, knowing how hard it can be to undo them. I think if we go back to some of the petrol excise relief and how difficult it was to try and unpick that once you offer people financial support, unoffering it.
Turning the tap off.
Turning the tap off is a really difficult thing to do. So I think that's just a way to build in a little bit of restraint, and possibly also goes to the argument, as you're saying, it's less controversial this time around in terms of trying to artificially bring down inflation. I think we've got to the point where, the Reserve Bank has said, well, yes, it does, but we can look through that and we can see that. But I think it also, continuing to say it's a temporary measure, takes away from that kind of impression that, we're trying to keep fudging the numbers on the macroeconomic figures.
They have spent $40 billion since January in what's been an election campaign
40
since
now,
January.
is it? Yeah,
up to 40, around 40, and they've been the highest spending government in about 50 years in spend to GDP. So I think they've looked for the minimum option here. Everyone expected they would do this measure. They've done the measure. Makes it hard for the opposition to say no, and they're trying to be as restrained as possible.
And clearly, despite the cost of the budget and the arguments over, its impact on inflation, the Prime Minister knows this is popular. You're giving people this sort of relief is popular, and he was out very early this morning to sell it.
Labor will take another $150 right off your power bills. 2 payments of $75 each for every household. This is cost of living relief when it's needed right across the country.
So the opposition has already this morning indicated that it won't stand in the way. Just a little technical here, but the first time the government did energy bill relief was at the end of 2022, and that was part of a bigger piece of legislation that included price caps on coal and gas. The opposition voted no to that. Last year, when they did the energy bill relief, there wasn't a specific bill for the energy bill relief. It was in the appropriations bill, the general budget bill, so that went through. This time around, Mel, the opposition not standing in the way, and they've made that clear up front. Why?
Look, I think we're at a very different place than we were in January when Peter Dutton was giving a speech saying that these kind of sugar hits were something that the coalition wanted to oppose, where 1 minute to an election, the imperative of not standing in the way of something popular that goes directly to people's hip pocket is clearly overriding the greater economic vision that Peter Dutton wanted to set out at the start of the year. It's amazing what 2 months closer to an election can do.
And it's, Mark, they've backed in the bulk billing incentive, the cheaper medicines, all the health measures that have been...
Bipartisanship is in the air, David.
It certainly is. Does that undercut, though, their argument about there's too much spending going on?
Well, it's always going to make it more difficult to argue that the government's spending too much money while at the same time on a number of key sort of announcements that the government makes, you decide to support them as well, because it's politically well, I won't say convenient, but sort of important that you do so. No politician wants to stand between voters and free money, as it were, just sort of weeks out from an election.
But we are going back into deficit, right? We did have the 2 surpluses, now we go back into deficit at a time when there's all this global uncertainty going on. How worried should we be about that?
Well, people in the coalition have noticed that on the doors, as they've been campaigning this term, something they're hearing a lot is people in the community are really interested in this HEX 20% cut. And the coalition said they won't do it. Labor said they will do it if they get in. So it's effectively a bribe. You vote for Labor, you get a 20% cut off your HEX. If they're to say no to this energy bill relief, it's lower energy bills, lower HEX if Labor wins, none of that if the coalition wins. So is it good policy making for the government to act this way and effectively say vote for us and you're going to get free money? No. Does it mask the fact that we are in a structural deficit? Would economists go mad at this kind of electioneering? Yes, but that's where we're at.
There won't be, as I mentioned, Mel, extra defence spending in this budget on top of what's already committed, and the government would say there's a lot that's already been committed, and you saw that chart earlier. The opposition, however, is still thinking about hinting at some announcement before the election on spending and defence.
It seems the coalition is considering trying to get to a 2.5% of GDP spending target, which would be a very big step up. And if you were to try to do that in the space of a couple of years, which seems to be at least what the Shadow Defence Minister would like to do, that is going to require a heck of a lot more government spending in the meantime. I think we need to see if the government might still shuffle some funding around, even if the envelope is the same, how that's rolled out over the next 4 years and over the next 10 years, which is, you know, the more likely horizon for a lot of these big defence procurement spending issues. I think we still need to see what they might be willing to do there. But it makes the fiscal argument much harder to make if we're also adding extra defence spending on top of matching all of these health policy announcements that Labor's been making.
And of course, we know how this plays during an election campaign. If the opposition does do that, if it commits significant new funds to increase defence spending, then obviously that will be looked at in terms of their overall book, the money they don't have available to spend on other programs. And that's what the government would be saying. They're spending money on this, they're accelerating this budget line quite dramatically, and this means that they're going to have to be even more severe cuts in other areas or new revenue, whatever. You know, it's the sort of standard argument, but it will be a legitimate argument to have, because any extra spending at the moment on top of a situation where, as Paul says, we're already in deficit, structural deficit, needs to be accounted for somehow.
You can see the momentum behind this. We've got to do
globally,
defence. It's not just the Trump administration telling us to do it. It's the likes of Kim Beazley and others who are also saying we've got to move.
And we've even got the Greens offering spending on defence projects, albeit taking it from some and putting it to another. It's a different occasion, but nonetheless, they're out there spruiking a defence policy. So I think that tells you how much all of the minds are focused on it at the moment.
A lot of hate online from the online left towards the Greens. Is that announcement saying the Greens talking about missiles? What?
Yeah, that's the era we're in. All right, well, time to get some answers on some of this stuff from the Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor. To take us there, here was Treasurer Jim Chalmers this morning talking to my colleague Jane Norman about the energy bill relief.
Well, this means that power bills would be lower than otherwise. And what we've seen in the first two...
But using taxpayers' money to do that.
Well, what we've seen in the first 2 rounds of energy bill rebates is we've taken some of the sting off these electricity costs. You know, to the year to December last year, we saw a 25% decrease in electricity costs in the official inflation data. And so that's what we're trying to do, to take some of the edge off these electricity costs. Without our assistance and without our interventions here, electricity would be more expensive.
Angus Taylor, welcome to the program.
Good to be with you, David.
So will the coalition support this energy bill relief?
Yeah, we're not going to get in the way of it. And the starting point here, though, is very clear, which is Labor's failed on delivering its promise of a $275 power price reduction. In my electorate, Western Sydney, and the Minister for Energy's electorate, we've indeed seen a miss of $1,300. $1,300 more than Australians expected to pay at the last election from Labor's promises. It is a complete and utter disaster. We're not going to stand in the way of Labor cleaning up their own mess. This is putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. The solution here is to get a structural outcome, which is a reduction in underlying electricity prices, which has not been achieved, of course. It's gone the other way.
You did vote against this sort of energy bill relief initially, so why now? Is it just because an election is in the air?
Can I clarify that? We sought to split the bill. What we were against was the price caps, which have been a complete and utter failure. The gas and coal price caps, they have not worked. They were never going to work. And in fact, what they've done is they've made the situation worse because we're seeing supply drying up. And that is a disaster for this country. Chris Bowen wants the gas and coal industries gone. He's on a renewables-only tirade. Renewables are an important part of the system, but we need balance. And the lack of balance of this energy minister has meant bills are going up, including in his own electorate, $1,300 more than was promised by
So just
Labor.
on that point, would you repeal those price caps on coal and gas?
Well, I won't announce our policy ahead of time, but we were against it from the start. That was very clear. So
then you'd get rid of it.
we'll have more to say about our shorter-term energy policy in the coming weeks. But what is very clear about it, and I think you can guess where we're going here, we need to get more gas into the system. We need to make sure.
How do you do that?
Well, by getting Australian gas working for Australians. And that's exactly what we did when we were in power. You know, Australians have noticed that energy prices were substantially lower than when we were in power than they are now, Dave.
So when you when you say Australian gas working for Australians, it's a great line. Does that mean
a good line,
not exporting as much? You're going to force the LNG exporters to keep more here?
Well, it's a good line because it's good policy. That's the point.
What does it mean?
And what it means is you've got to get more gas going into the system to put downward pressure on prices. Labor didn't bother with that because they don't like the gas industry. They don't think natural gas has a role to play. So they said, we'll just impose price caps. Well, supply dries up. That's what happens. And you see the investment moving overseas, and Australians don't get access to the affordable energy they want and deserve.
Sounds very much to me like you'll force those exporters to keep more gas here.
Well, we'll make sure that Australian gas is working for Australians. We'll make sure that there's more gas going into the system. That's what we did when we were last in power. And David, the important thing about this is it worked. And the best indicator of future performance is past performance.
I want to come back to the budget and spending. You know, you're going to back this energy bill relief. You've backed a lot of the government's recent spending promises, particularly on the health front. Got some of them here. You can see all of these health announcements that the government's been making, whether it's the bulk billing incentive, $8.5 billion, public hospitals, $1.7 billion, money for women's health, urgent care clinics, cheaper medicines. You're also going further, your own $500 million for psychology sessions. Can we afford all of this spending?
Well, we've opposed over $100 billion of Labor spending in this term of Parliament. Over $100 billion worth, but not on essential services, and we're not going to get in the way of Labor cleaning up their own mess, which is exactly what we're seeing here with energy bills. It's what we've seen with health, with a sharp reduction in bulk billing. We're not going to get in the way of that, but we will call out bad spending, wasteful spending, and we have done over $100 billion. The rapid growth of government, Canberra-based public service growing by around 20%, 36,000 public servants. We'll get more numbers on that, no doubt, this week. This is at a time when households are struggling to pay the bills, at a time when small businesses are going backwards, 29,000 insolvencies.
Well, I'll come back to the public service, but just looking at your spending plans, how much is your tax-deductible business lunch policy going to cost taxpayers?
Well, as we've said many, many times, David, we'll put out our costings before the election. But what I can say is that in aggregate, our position will be stronger than Labor's. And most importantly, we'll re-establish the fiscal guardrails. These are absolutely crucial. One of the first things Jim Chalmers did...
What does that mean? Explain what that...
Well, one of the first things Jim Chalmers did when he came to power is threw out a lot of rules that had been in the budget. What are these rules? Things like making sure you grow the economy faster than spending, making sure you have a tax to GDP cap. And what that does...
Tax to GDP cap's 23.9%. Yeah. Tax has not been above that level. It's not forecast to be above that level. Would that save any...
Well, tax has gone up for the average Australian by $3,500, personal income tax by $3,500 for the average Australian, $7,000 for a double income couple. Since Labor came to power, despite their version of the stage 3 tax cuts, tax has been going up. Those fiscal guardrails, by the way, the reason they are so important is they discipline the government. So they discipline the bureaucracy, they discipline colleagues, and Jim Chalmers has lost control.
So spending wouldn't go up beyond GDP?
You would ensure, as we did when we were last in government, your economy grows faster than spending. Crucial to that is boost growth. Make sure you've got a strong growing economy. It's why we've said we'll up the productivity goals. Labor's given up the ghost on that. And make sure that the economy is growing faster.
Defence, NDIS, none of these things will rise faster than GDP.
No, the aggregate spending is
overall spending.
Because that's how you beat inflation. This is how you boost growth. It's how you make sure you're backing small businesses by giving them the space to succeed.
So coming back to your spending plans, we don't know the cost of the tax-deductible lunch. We'll find out sometime in the campaign. What about the nuclear power plan? What will that cost?
Well, as we've said, it's going to cost Australians far less. A 44%.
I'm asking what it'll cost.
But what ultimately matters is what Australians are going to pay.
But do you know?
I mean, in energy, well, I do know. It's 44% reduction.
No, the cost.
Well, that's the cost. A 44% reduction in costs of the energy system.
No. I'm
under
asking.
Our
sorry
plans,
about the confusion. I'm just asking what it's going to cost Australia to build nuclear power plants.
44% less than the alternative.
Which is what?
And this is the crucial point. Around, you know those numbers, they were put out by Labor, around $600 billion.
What's your plan cost?
So 44% less. And let me explain this. The point about this, which is crucial, is that under Labor's plan, they'll be building thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of kilometres of power lines. They'll have to back up their renewables-only strategy. And that means the energy system's going to cost far more than it needs to, and they're overbuilding. All of that means that the alternative we've put forward, which we've modelled, we've put out those costings.
So what is the cost?
44% lower cost.
Can you tell us the dollars? What's the, so people can understand what the cost is.
Well, 44% less. Labor's $600 billion in total for the system through to 2050,
so
and ours $44% less than that. And that is let's be clear, that is not all paid for by government. Some of that, a significant portion of that, will be private sector investment, and should be private sector investment. So, David,
but your plan's taxpayer funded.
No, a significant portion of it will be paid for by the private sector. I mean, transmission lines
right,
today...
the nuclear plants, though.
Transmission lines today should be paid for by the private sector. They're not under Labor, by the way. I mean, Labor has decided that they're going to use public funding for our transmission lines when we've long had a system in place where the private sector has incentives to invest in those transmission lines. And we even see in the last month that it is absolutely unnecessary for the public sector to be investing in those transmission lines. So we'll restrict government's role to what is absolutely necessary.
The nuclear
7 nuclear generators, which we've been clear about, which will cost around under $20 billion each. We've been clear about that.
Okay.
And David, the important point about this is that can deliver over time the lower power prices Australians want.
Right.
As in the short term, we drive supply into the system to make sure they get that relief on the energy bills, which is structural and permanent rather than temporary.
You've promised $3 billion to buy more F-35 fighter jets.
Yeah.
Is that new money for defence, or are you going to cut another defence program to pay for that?
Well, as I say, we'll put out our costings before the election, and we've already been clear about the F-35s. But this is a down payment on making sure we've got the capability we need as a country at a time that is increasingly uncertain.
Will you lift defence spending, though, overall?
Well, let's see what the headroom is in the budget. I mean, we're all waiting for this budget. You want answers from me before I've actually seen
you're making
budget.
Promises.
My guess,
you're making promises.
Well, we're making promises we know we can afford, but we're going to see what's in the budget and how much headroom there is in the budget.
So you haven't worked out yet whether you'll increase
Well,
defence
at the end of the day, we don't know what the situation is we're dealing with a Labor government that has lost control of its spending, how much fiscal headroom there will be. And we're looking forward to seeing that this week. So I hope there's a lot of transparency on that, Dave.
The talk of the coalition committing to 2.5% of GDP going to defence, which would be, I think, a $15 billion annual increase from where we are now. There's no decision on that yet.
Well, let's be clear. The best way to increase spending on defence is to have a strong economy. The stronger the economy, whatever number you pick, the more the dollars are.
Sure.
And this is why we are so focused on boosting growth, beating inflation, backing small business, fixing the housing supply in this country, delivering affordable, reliable energy that all Australians deserve.
Will you set any money aside for a referendum?
Well, David, we've been clear about this policy. That is a last resort. But what we will focus on as a top priority is keeping Australians safe.
But it's the only resort. If you want to change the Constitution, you've got to have a referendum.
Well, it's long been coalition policy. You'll remember the debate from 10 years ago that citizenship that is achieved through fraudulence or indeed terrorist acts from dual citizens, these people are not deserving of being citizens of this country. That was a decision we made 10 years ago. It remains coalition policy.
Yeah, and the High Court...
We'll do what we have to make sure we can implement that policy. But any constitutional change would absolutely be a last resort.
But would you set money aside for a referendum? They're not cheap.
Well, it's a last resort and it's not part of our core plans right now.
So it's not going to be...
Let's be clear, we will do it as a break glass option because one thing we're not going to do, which this government has done, is been weak on national security issues and keeping Australians safe.
So come back to the public service. Your colleague Jane Hume said this morning on Sky News you'd go back to the level of the public service that we had post-COVID. That's on my reading of the budget papers, 173,500. So you would cut 36,000 positions?
Well, as I say, we don't know how many positions Labor has put in place. We'll find out more in the budget. The last number we had was 36,000. It's been growing more. We know that it's been growing at a rapid pace.
So you'd cut 36,000 at least.
Well, as I say, let's see what's in the budget. But what we've been very clear about is we want to get back to where we were when we were last in government. That shouldn't be in areas of frontline services. It should be in the back office areas. Labor has grown the size of the public service. Well, Labor has grown the size of the public service at a rapid rate, 20% so far, and maybe more. We'll find out in the budget. There were black holes in their last budget on these costings, so we'll see what it looks like. But what I do know, David, is that despite the fact that the size of the public service has grown, customer service has gone backwards. I mean, we've seen bulk billing rates fall from 88% to 77%, despite a 40% increase in the size of the Department of Health.
Yeah,
this is not. It is not
using the COVID figures.
But this is not. This is not
just coming back to the public service, would you also, if you're going to go back to that level, would you also go back to using 54,000 external Labor workers?
Well, you know, David, Labor pretends that what they've done is switch one for the other. But let me tell you, government spending continues to grow at a rapid rate to the highest level we've seen for 50 years, as you just heard. So, look, the fact of the matter is their policies are not working in this area. The public service has not been able to deliver the outcomes we want to see in areas like health. We need a productive, effective public service, and we have some amazing people in our public service. But a bigger team is not always a better team, as I've learned over the course of my career. It needs to be an effective, productive team.
Will you cut foreign aid?
Look, again, we'll put out our policies before the election in those areas and others.
Don't you think
we've been clear, we've been clear on $100 billion of spending that we're opposing, David, and you haven't asked any questions about any of those areas. Very clear. And we've opposed those, in most cases, in votes in the Parliament. There's no ambiguity here. And that is, by the way, I should say, that is not in areas of essential services for Australians. It's on programs that are not delivering for the Australian public, and it's as big a step in fiscal prudence as any opposition has taken since Malcolm Fraser in 1975, and we're not proposing to go back to that.
Okay, does that mean you'd get a surplus in the next term of Parliament?
Well, what we'll do is we'll make sure over time we're moving to structural balance, and that's the key here, which means growing the economy faster than spending. It's what we did when we were last in government, and it worked.
I want to ask you about the migration figures. Has been a big focus for the coalition. We saw during the week the latest figures. We can show them here. Net overseas migrations come off the peak that it hit of just over 550,000 people. Net overseas migrations come down about a third from that peak. You said this time last year that you would reduce that by a further 25%. Is that still your plan?
Well, what you're missing in that chart is that is way above what Labor forecast. And they keep missing their forecasts. They keep missing their forecasts. We'll get a new set of forecasts out in the budget. What we've been clear about is we will reduce permanent migration by around 25%. We've given those numbers.
But what about net overseas migration? That's the big one. That's what you said last year.
I'll just work through each of the pieces of it. So Permanent migration, we've laid out where we're planning to go.
Well, not how you...
With the humanitarian... Well, we'll set lower caps. I mean, it's simple. And that's how permanent migration works in this country. We'll get the humanitarian intake, which is amongst the most generous in the world, back to where it was when we were last in government. And it's true that the international student numbers have broken all records. And we're getting to a position where at our G8 universities, our biggest universities or our most prominent universities, that we're seeing international student numbers close to 50%, and we think that's way above what's acceptable. So we'll look at the numbers that come out. What's clear is they keep moving, and they keep moving up.
Well, they're coming down now.
Well, versus the forecast, so they haven't come down.
Okay, your commitment to reduce that net overseas migration by 25% is no longer a commitment for 25% reduction.
Well, we'll put out the numbers when we see the budget. Okay. But what you can be clear about, David, no ambiguity about this, is it will be lower under us, and we've already laid out how we'll achieve that.
And will that hurt the economy?
Well, you know what? GDP per capita is the number that matters to Australians, and it's gone backwards for 7 consecutive quarters under this government. The only thing driving the economy for the last 2 years has been Australians working more, and that is a recipe for a collapse in our standard of living, and we've seen the biggest collapse in history, unprecedented, unrivalled. No other peer country in the world where we've seen that collapse in standard of living.
I've got to ask you about insurance too, because there's been some confusion about whether you would seek to break up insurance companies in government. A couple of weeks ago you said no, we've been clear about that. Peter Dutton keeps talking about it. What's the position?
Well, insurance premiums have gone up too much for Australians, and we've already announced important policies that will make a difference to that. For instance, making sure that our prudential regulator isn't over-regulating our insurers so they have to raise premiums more than they need to. Making sure that the construction sector is efficient in this country. And with the CFMEU, we've seen a construction sector that has been at the beckon of a union with deep links to the criminal underworld.
So what's the answer to the question, though? Will you break up insurance companies?
Well, we've said again that we're prepared to take action where there's clear evidence of an abuse of market power, or there's concerns about abuse of market power or anti-competitive conduct. We've taken action when we were in government. We took action against the energy companies on this. More recently, I've helped to draft legislation which is sitting in the Parliament now to take action on supermarkets and hardware, and we're prepared to act if we see evidence of abuse of market power and anti-competitive behaviour.
So when you said a couple of weeks ago no, it's now a maybe.
No, we've been clear about it all along, which is if we see abuse of market power, if we see anti-competitive conduct, and Australians are clearly suffering as a result of that, and divestiture can play a role in helping to address that, we will act. Right. We have acted in the past, and we'll act in the future.
Final one, Angus Taylor, should the coalition not get there at this election? We heard Jim Chalmers ask this morning about the leadership. What about you? Would you seek the leadership?
You know, David, I am absolutely focused on one thing and one thing only now, which is getting rid of a bad Labor government that has meant that Australians are worse off than they were 3 years ago. They can't afford another 3 years of that. That is my absolute and utter focus, because Australians need better than what they've got under Labor.
That's not a no.
Oh, David, right now I'm focused on winning this election and a majority coalition government, because we cannot afford either a Labor majority or a Teals Green Labor coalition, which would be an absolute and utter disaster.
All right, Angus Taylor, thanks so much for joining us this morning. And it's a big budget week coming up. We're going to come back to some of the measures there, including on the public service, where this is going and what the concerns are about any cuts to the public service. Let's get back to our panel first, though. We're joined once again by Kenny, Melissa Clarke and Paul Sakkal. Look, just a bit to pick up there from Angus Taylor. They're backing in the spending, as we knew, on the energy bill relief, backing in some of those health spending measures as well there, Mark, but continuing to insist they would have a better bottom line because of the things that they have opposed elsewhere in the budget.
Yes, well, there's some good intentions there, but not a lot of detail. I suppose you could say that about both sides. We haven't seen the budget, and that's really Angus Taylor's defence for not sort of going to the detail of how they'll get there in all of these areas. Just saying that there'll be less spending under a coalition government, and the budget, you know, this sort of promise to get the budget back into structural balance over a reasonable time frame. Quite a challenge when you consider where the budget is at the moment, and where you consider the spending that's already been agreed to, as you showed there, the spending that the government's proposing that the coalition's agreeing to, plus its own additional spending that it's talking about doing. So, yeah, you know, Australians would rightly say they don't know much more at the moment.
And the cost of the... Yeah, sorry, Mel.
Oh, I was just going to say it's made even harder to try and understand exactly how a coalition budget in this circumstance would look, because a lot of the savings that Angus Taylor is talking about that the coalition has committed to are things that are over a long period of time frame, like that are over the next 10 years. But a lot of the spending they've committed to matching is over the next 4 years. So without any further detail, it's really hard to see how this commitment to fiscal rectitude matches up with the commitments that have been made, because the timeframes don't match up either.
There are a few things that we don't know, and that was clear in the interview in terms of where the coalition's going to land, be it on defence spending, be it on migration numbers. Now that 25% commitment seems to have gone. The cost of their business, tax-deductible business lunch idea. There's a lot to come in the coming weeks from the coalition, Paul.
A lot to come. There's not much detail, a lot of commitment to do something better than Labor without saying how, confusion over insurance, mixed messaging on the referendum question, lack of clarity on the migration numbers. The one thing they do have a certain number on, because they got Frontier Economics to give them a number, which is highly contestable, was the nuclear figure. I'm not sure why he was evasive there. He kept saying 44% less. There is a number there. It's $331 billion over the period to 2050.
I was saying 360, but you're right. It's 331.
Yeah, it's 331, which is $260 billion less, the coalition claims, than Labor. So it was done, that modelling, so he could just say it.
But the two figures are sort of are apples and oranges, though, aren't they? I mean,
totally.
We're talking about $331 billion. Admittedly, Angus Taylor was throwing in there that there will be some private investment, but essentially the promise, as we had it originally made, was that this was going to be publicly owned, publicly built nuclear power, right?
And we should point out that the government, of course, denies $600 billion is the cost of its figure, I think.
Precisely. So there's so much elasticity around this, and there are so many sort of definitions and intentions and the like. I mean, would this, for example, even whatever the figure is, let's say it's not 331, let's say it's 200 billion that's on the public books, is that an off-book expense? You know, which the coalition's been quite critical of the number of sort of off-budget items that this government has been ploughing money into. Would this be one of those, or would this be, you know, coming straight out of the budget?
Nuclear is a great talking point for them because it allows them to lean on something to say this is how we get to net zero. But it's clear that at this stage, given how far off into the future it is, it doesn't stand up to rigorous questioning.
No, but they're going to get more gas. I picked up at the start of that interview. What was the line? More Australian gas for Australia.
Yeah, get Australian gas working for Australia.
Yeah, so we currently have, this will get a bit technically complicated here for me, but we currently have the mechanism at the moment, the domestic gas reservation mechanism, I think, or words to that effect, where they can annually negotiate with the gas companies to keep a certain amount in Australia. It sounds like the coalition might say they're going to go a whole lot further in terms of reserving Australian gas here.
They've actually done a reasonable job in this term of government of convincing the gas companies to provide a huge amount of extra petajoules worth of gas for domestic use, using those policies as the basis for those negotiations. So I don't think that's quite as critical as it seems. There's a longer term question about how long we need gas and what supply we currently have available to do that. And that's a very real question. But when you have market indicators over a long period of time that we're trying to move our energy system to a lower emissions one, that tells companies, don't stump up investment in this area. It's the mixed signals again that are going to cause great confusion for a long-term transition if every 3 years we have a change of government that sends a different signal to the resources sector about how willing they are to invest or maintain that technology.
Yeah, this is just bedevilled policy in this area all the way through, this constant bickering and changing of policy and undermining of whatever the arrangements are at the moment in favour of some potential new arrangements. But I do think in political terms, most Australians would say if we're a major exporter of gas, we should have abundant supplies of gas. It's sort of it seems like a no-brainer, and so to that extent, it certainly has popular appeal. It's just that this is, as you introduced it, a highly technical area.
The coalition has, sorry, just to interrupt, they have recently said a few weeks ago, the resources shadow, that they are going to move in the direction of a reserve, but not all the way to a full reserve model. It's unclear how it will work.
Quasi-reserve.
And they're talking over the weekend about whether to release their more short-term energy bill kind of policy that talks about local gas use over the next few days, potentially before the budget reply speech.
The public service, is that becoming clearer now where they're going to land? Oh, this Mark's shaking his head. Is it going to be 36,000 cut if they're talking about going back to post-COVID levels of the public service?
I think that's the number that they've hit upon, but again, there are elasticities
If you think that's
here.
clear, that's great, because I don't think that's clear at all.
Well, I mean, Angus Taylor did say they'd wait and see the numbers on Tuesday night, but they're not going to be any smaller for the public service, so presumably it's a 36,000 cut.
Well, 36,000 is the number they say it's increased by, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So presumably it's the minimum. That's it at a minimum. But I mean,
But they've also said they're not going to cut frontline services, and a number of those increases have been in frontline services. So those statements don't match up either.
Well, as the Prime Minister's been pointing out every other day, NEMA, the National Emergency Management Authority, have been heavily involved with the ex-tropical cyclone and so on. That's an entirely new agency of government that has come along in that time. Now, that is frontline services, but to some degree there's always back office as well that you need. I did talk on the podcast this week to Danielle Wood, she's the chair of the Productivity Commission, asked her about this idea of cutting the public service, and she doesn't think it would actually save much money in the scheme of things and could even have a detrimental impact.
In the percentage of government spending, it's small.
Right.
So, it's often a sideshow, I think, those kind of debates. I'd actually be worried if we were to seriously reduce public service capability, we might reduce the capacity to deliver some of the reforms that I'm talking about.
Yeah, who knew? You actually do need some policy experts to design policy, implement policy to make sure it doesn't go right off the rails.
Especially if we're going to introduce a whole new nuclear industry in the nation. Guess what? We're actually going to need a lot of regulators in that space.
It's interesting. There are 5 seats in the ACT. Of course, this is the locus of the majority of public servants. The Liberals always had at least one of them, with one of those being a Senate seat. I'm talking about 5 seats overall, 3 House of Reps, 2 Senate. And the Libs, for a long time, had one of those seats. Of course, with David Pocock's election last time, that's over, and there doesn't look like there's any real prospect of a seat becoming available, of the Libs getting that seat back. And you can see it reflected in this policy. They're suddenly sort of unleashed in terms of the public service.
Just on this, a lot of pressure on him, Angus Taylor coming into that interview. Almost feels like, we are on the eve of an election. But just a point to make about where we're at in the cycle. There's been about 3 weeks of fever pitch speculation about their plans, really strong pressure on the opposition to reveal what they will do if they win. I think the cyclone, looking back, was a really key sliding doors moment. The media started to put real pressure on Dutton and Taylor to release their plans because we thought we'd be in an election now and weeks into it. We've actually had this free time where the coalition has said, no, we will still release our policies in the campaign, but there's been really heavy scrutiny on them. So this new time that's been created has almost created this 3-week little election contest where Dutton and Taylor have struggled under pressure and created that kind of circumstance where they have the scrutiny of an election campaign put on them, but they have nothing to say yet.
They've been very focused on this is how we want to roll out in a campaign. The unexpected 2-week break has meant they haven't really had something to fill that space with, whereas the government's had the benefit of incumbency to say, well, we can respond to the cyclone and here's the activity we can show we're doing in this time. They've been able to fruitfully use this sort of 2-3 week period where the coalition struggled.
Yeah, it's a good point. A few other things. Supermarkets, the other day we saw the ACCC's report. It told us that they're amongst the most profitable in the world, Coles and Woolies. I did find it interesting in the report, though, prices over the last 5 years have gone up a lot, but not that much different to the rest of the economy and not that much, in fact, maybe a little better than in other OECD countries for their grocery prices. Various recommendations, a lot of them the government's already doing. The Nationals leader, David Littleproud, though, was rather nonplussed with the ACCC's recommendations.
It does nothing to address the power of the supermarkets. It's like every other ACCC inquiry. It says we need more transparency, more reporting. We've done that. But unless there is a deterrent, unless there is a consequence for doing the wrong thing, then it's business as usual for these big supermarkets. They don't fear Anthony Albanese.
So the Nationals, the Coalition and the Greens want a divestiture power to force the breakup of supermarkets. This ACCC report didn't really look into that, though, did it? Mark?
No, it didn't, and it doesn't really appear that there's much that's really going to come from it. As you say, it sort of showed high profitability globally, sort of, you know, comparable price rises over the study period and the like. There's a lot of heat around this. It's a bit like gas, right? There's a lot of kind of gesturing going on, but when you get to the detail, it doesn't amount to much. Even if you look at the policy and take it quite literally, it's a divestiture power. It doesn't necessarily mean that there would be any structural change, that power would actually be used. And it's the same with when it's got extended, which seemed to be, speaking of thought bubbles, what happened in relation to insurance companies in Queensland in particular.
And I know this isn't going to be front of mind for voters as they go into the ballot box, you know, is the divestiture power of the coalition going to apply to insurance companies? But it does speak to this, you know, have they sorted out their position on things? Is their policy clear on things, or is there a difference between the leader and the shadow treasurer? What did you make of the answers there?
Look, publicly is certainly trying to back in the idea of divestiture powers being useful to use, but I think we all know from speaking to people behind the scenes, it's a very contested space within the party. It is not something that fits naturally or easily within the Liberal Party in particular, let alone throwing into the dynamics the coalition, which is the Nationals as part of the coalition, which are much more willing to adopt policies that would see significant interventions in market spaces. So no, it's not clear, and no, it's not settled within the Liberal Party.
I think it's worth noting that these laws exist in the UK and the US without much controversy. They are an absolute last resort. They send a signal to uncompetitive companies.
And there are former ACCC bosses here who also back it, think that we should be doing something like this as a threat, at least.
The Prime Minister sounds like Ronald Reagan talking about these laws. He talks about Soviet-era laws. They exist.
They're pretty common. Anyway, talking about coalition, you know, differences or confusion brings us to your story, Paul, this week on the idea of a referendum to allow the minister, rather than the courts, to boot out a dual national or strip the citizenship from a dual national who is engaged in terrorism, maybe pedophilia, maybe, I don't know. Is it clear what the position is?
It's not fully clear.
So much.
Yeah, he has talked also, and shadow ministers have talked about potentially anti-Semitic hate speech and other forms of terror glorification forming part of this package. They will release a more formal election kind of suite of policies around citizenship during the campaign. I think this will form part of it. They will talk about a referendum as a last resort, as Angus Taylor says. I think this caused a big stir this week, obviously, when the debate emerged on Tuesday. I think what it displayed and the tension it exposed was that part of the reason why people in the coalition who didn't have much time for Scott Morrison, like Peter Dutton, is because he's values-driven, not polling-driven. He's willing to take on a really contentious idea and drive the debate rather than have opinion occur in the community and then give into it. He likes to drive opinion. This is a contentious idea. It caused a big stir in the campaign headquarters. They thought, he's railed against The Voice for a year and a half. Why are we talking about a referendum? This isn't the right time to talk about it. Maybe all those points are true on the tactics and the politics, but he's willing to have the debate. And that, I imagine, will be a point of contention in the campaign. He's not a Morrison-style tactics-driven leader.
But the same values that he's presenting in pursuing this with such conviction is the same thing that causes a lot of tension within the Liberal Party, because we have seen this, as Angus Taylor said, over 10 years. We've seen some within the Liberal Party pursue this idea of being able to strip citizenship. It pairs in with their ideas around where the power should lie to deal with things like immigration detention, things that are not actually in the hands of the executive, that are in the hands of the judiciary, and that the High Court is being very careful to ring fence at this point in time. So whilst it might show a display of a focus and a belief, it also continues to exacerbate tension within the party about whether that's the sort of value that should be pursued.
We saw a blistering piece from George Brandis in your paper, the former Attorney General, making all the points about why this power should not rest with a politician to strip someone's citizenship.
And that's ultimately the question that would have to be put to people if they got to this last case resort. It's not should citizenship be stripped from someone because that power exists under the judiciary. It's should politicians have that power. It's hard to see a great deal of public support for giving politicians that power.
Jane Hume and David Coleman have just been anointed the new leaders of the moderates formally, so they'll be the ones to take up the fight to him in the shadow cabinet.
It's a bit like gas that we were talking about, divestiture as well, supermarket supermarkets and the like, there's a gesture here rather than detail, and it's about the signal it sends to voters. It fits in with the brand that Peter Dutton is known for and trying to sort of sell in the election, which is that he's strong on national security, that he's strong on these questions of leadership, and that he will be the sort of leader that doesn't faff about with these things. But of course, there's a whole lot of faffing about going on with this. The other thing is, I mean, everyone talks about the cost of the referendum, the last one, and how it seems pretty curious that it's being floated again. One, it's not even the first thing that he's floated. He did float a referendum himself on recognition, which he then sort of quickly avoided. So you've got that, but also there's this sort of whole question of what he's proposing at the moment would mean for the notion of citizenship, because a key argument that the Conservatives ran against the Voice was that it created differential citizenship. It created two classes of citizens in some way. And now they're talking about having citizenship. I mean, something like a third of Australians are dual citizens.
Well, they're talking about deporting people who've been convicted of very serious crimes.
Sure, but if you could, but the point is, an Australian with normal Australian citizenship, if I could put it like that, could commit any crime and know that they will still be in Australia, whereas someone else could be convicted of a crime, and theoretically, even if they hadn't, committed that crime, because that's always at least a statistical possibility.
And they pointed out this week, if a dual citizen gets charged with one of these serious crimes, they could just recuse their second citizenship and ensure they don't get deported.
Yeah, or be sent to it, and the prospect is for being sent to a country with which you've had no association at any time. We just saw a whole lot of MPs in 2017 who found out
I'm a dual citizen. Look, we're running out of time, and I was going to get into the fears of the next round of Trump tariffs that are coming in about 10 days from now, but look, we'll save that for when we know more about them. But I did just want to touch on the childcare issue, because we saw a really shocking Four Corners story on Monday night about claims of abuse and neglect, some terrible stuff going on in the childcare sector, particularly the for-profit run centres. Mel, it's a bit complicated, and this is part of the problem, the way the sector, which has grown and grown and grown, is regulated to ensure there is quality. Was the government's response a little underwhelming to all of this, though?
Well, I think it was, and I think many parents are frustrated that there's not a clearer answer of how these very clear and obvious problems are going to be addressed. I think, we're the better part of a week on, and it's still not exactly clear about how we can tackle the really egregious things we saw in that report. Part of it is that we have a national quality framework, but we have states and territories that regulate under that framework, but then the funding comes from the Commonwealth. So again, a lovely point of our federation, making it a little bit complicated as to ultimately where the buck lies. Can you blame states and territories for not regulating if they don't feel they've got the financial support? Can we blame the government if they're not spending enough but they don't actually get to implement it? It's incredibly messy. At the same time, just briefly, part of the problem we have here is there is so much demand for childcare that the regular market forces you might be able to rely on to weed out the bad players doesn't exist.
Are really weakened.
Because you have to take whatever childcare you can get, and for most people, they can't even get as many days as they would like. So there's no, well, I've got a bad vibe about this place, or they've done this one action, I'm going to take my child and use my money to force that business out by taking it to a better operator, because there's just not the choice.
No, well, anyway, we'll come back to this one as well, but we're going to have to move on. Our panel, Paul Sakkal, Melissa Clarke and Mark Kenny, will be back very shortly with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm photographer Mike Bowers. I'm talking pictures this morning with freelance cartoonist Glen Le Lievre, and a very warm welcome back.
Thanks, Mike. What'd I miss?
Nothing. Glenn, this week Peter Dutton launched a dual citizenship thought bubble, which turned out to be more like a lead balloon, really.
Pete's full of thought balloons, isn't he?
Yeah. Fiona Katauskas has got pick your scare, really, with the Wheel of Misfortune. Why waste time on a real campaign when scare campaigns are so much easier?
Potential Prime Minister Pete's. Wheel of misfortune. The thing about scare campaigns is they always end up being a very tiny guy about yay big in a bedsheet.
Organised crime, dual citizen crims, terrorist caravans, oyster parliament,
African gangs,
climate targets and refugees. Kathy Wilcox has done the stages of brainwaves here as the opposition leader starts to have the inklings of a thought bubble.
Yeah, so you can make your own constipation noises at home, folks.
Uh-oh.
Here he goes again.
Raise the alert, rally the troops.
Put the comms team on standby.
Action stations.
Aha, a referendum on kicking out terrorists and pedophiles.
Damage control.
They should have it cleaned up by Friday.
Yeah.
I think there's too much libel in his diet.
I did love this David Rowe this week. He's got trouble getting your policies up, suffering from electile dysfunction.
You may be eligible under the PBS for Trumps.
Trump pills. They're vibing very suppository.
Suppository, a choking hazard. Well, either way, very hard to swallow.
Peter Dutton, take 2 Trumps daily or as your spin doctor prescribes. If tariffs persist, call said spin doctor. Presidential benefits scheme. Do you think someone will bulk bill him for it?
Hopefully.
Revelations of the involvement of organised crime, the CFMEU in Victoria. Mark Knight, Victoria's big bill, he's got stomping out crime, which is not quite what I think they had in mind here. We will stamp them out.
Mark's drawn the construction branch of the CFMEU. Mark's also drawn in the other branches of the union: forestry, maritime, mining and energy.
I love this David Rowe cartoon, Queasy Rider, the mild one, coming to a construction site near you. He's on Moped Pete here with the Gina colours on.
The thing I love about this is the colander stack hat.
Yeah.
Thoughts go in, thoughts come out.
Michaela here, we got this, Peter.
Michaela doesn't need a helmet because she's got the hair.
The government is hoping that its pre-election budget will be on the money, but it doesn't seem like there'll be Back in Black songs playing in the background. Warren Brown has done the wheel of reducing expectations here as Jim Chalmers is about to spin it. And what do we have here?
Putin, Cyclone Alfred, Gaza, the dog ate it, previous government, tariffs, Ukraine, Trump, China.
Why my budget won't be too flash.
I'd like to see a prize wheel made up of different types of budget-eating dogs.
Yeah. Round and round and round it goes, and where it stops, nobody knows. Finally, Glenn, ground operations unfortunately recommenced in Gaza, and Kathy Wilcox seems to think that these are not so smart bombs, and they started it. What would you do?
Most moral army, self-defence, human shields, Amalek.
And you've done this as a Giphy. It's a not so smart bomb here as it's flying along with Netanyahu, and both seem to be feeling their way.
Well, before they embarked on the flight, the bomb turned to Bibi and said, listen, I've been thinking about this and I don't think it's
not a good idea.
It's not a good idea.
It's been a great pleasure unpicking events this week. I'll let you do the honours.
Back to you, David Speers.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Mike. Let's get some final observations now. Paul.
2 really quick ones. There's a view inside Labor that the Prime Minister might call the election on Friday morning and potentially leak it out on Thursday to take attention away from the budget reply speech on Thursday night. And there's been a lot of leaking in the press against the man you interviewed, Angus Taylor, in recent weeks. If you're one of those people leaking, you better watch out if they win, because there's a hit list of potential leakers being drawn up.
Ooh, okay, well,
nasty.
There was an interesting gift from the coalition to environment groups this week, believe it or not. So we had the Shadow Environment Minister, John O'Duniam, join Peter Dutton in WA and say that they'd have, within 30 days, they would sort out the approval for the extension of the North West Shelf gas project so it could keep producing out to 2070. Peter Dutton, though, went one step further and said there was no conceivable reason why approval couldn't be given within 30 days. And in doing so, gave a pretty clear indication of a predetermined outcome in their views. They call it apprehended bias in the legal jargon, which would give Green groups very good legal grounds to challenge an approval once given if the government of the day has indicated that they've not made a decision before they've seen all the details. So a bit of a gift there.
Mark.
Yes, David Coleman, who you mentioned, Paul, before, he's the member for Banks. He's also the Shadow Foreign Spokesperson or Foreign Minister Shadow. I'm told that he won't hold that portfolio if they win. that he's been given that portfolio because there's a significant Chinese vote in his electorate, and they thought the seniority and status would be helpful in holding on to that seat. I think it's only a 2.6% margin, so interesting, particularly in light of his leadership of the moderate faction, as you say.
And whether they put James Patterson in that role post-election, we'll see. Thank you all very much for joining us this morning. Finally, one of the best things about election campaigns are those moments when a new candidate doesn't just stick to the talking points. The Liberal candidate in Braddon was asked about Peter Dutton's focus on dual nationals and a possible referendum. We'll leave you with his refreshingly honest answer. Thanks for watching.
Have you spoken with anyone on the North West Coast within Braddon about the referendum? Has this idea emerged? And is anyone actually talking to you about it?
No, they're not. So, people in Braddon are talking about access to health and health services, and they're talking about cost of living. Nobody's talking about this here.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.